The biggest risk to your security. Hi everyone, Leo Notenboom here for askleo.com. And yes, the answer ultimately turns out to be, well, you and me. We are the biggest risk to our own security. But what I want to address in this video is one very specific aspect of security that has become probably the most common way that hacks and infiltrations and breaches happen. It all comes back to people, but it all comes back to a very specific type of exploit that, honestly, even the best software can't protect you from. It's phishing. The biggest risk that you and I face on a day-to-day basis is phishing. Email that attempts to fool you into taking some kind of action by pretending to be something that it's not. For example, you might get email from a delivery company that says, hey, we've got a package for you. We need you to look at this attached invoice and confirm that it's what it's supposed to be or some other thing. And when you open that attachment, well, it's not an invoice or anything like that at all, right? It's malware. It's something that then runs on your machine and infects your machine. Similarly, there are scenarios where you'll get a delivery confirmation notice or a purchase confirmation for something that you didn't purchase. Somewhere in that mail will be a link that you're supposed to click on if you have any questions or if you want to dispute the charge or something like that. That link takes you to something that looks very real. It really does look like the site you expect it to be. Except, of course, the URL is incorrect because it's a phishing attempt. And the very first thing that it does when it fakes this site is asks you to log in. Since it looks like the site you kind of sort of expect, you log in. What does that mean? That means you hand your user ID and password over to the phisher, who can now go and compromise your account. Phishing attacks, I claim, will categorize into two very large buckets. One is what I will call phishing for malware. The intent of the phish is to get you to install or run malware on your machine. Most of the time, this is the malicious attachment that I mentioned earlier. You're asked to open up a document or do something that involves downloading an attachment that accompanied your email. Sometimes it'll even be an encrypted zip file and they will give you the password. Well, the reason it's a zip file is because your anti-malware software can't examine the contents of an encrypted zip file. So once you open the zip file and look at whatever document is within it, or run whatever document is within it, or do whatever with the zip file's contents, your machine is infected. It's also possible, but not as common, for malware to be installed with a malicious link. In other words, like the scenario I mentioned earlier, where you're offered a link to click on to take some kind of an action to rectify some kind of a problem that you see, that link might immediately download something that is then run on your machine. That's rare, but it can happen. Much more common is the downloaded attachment with some sense of urgency that, hey, you need to look at this document or you're going to lose out on this, we're going to charge you a bunch of that, we're going to do whatever. Again, it's an attachment and they're trying to fool you into opening or running it. Now, the other broad class of phishing attacks I will refer to as phishing for credentials. And that's the scenario I mentioned earlier where you get a piece of email that is somehow telling you, hey, you're about to get this, or we're about to charge you that. If you have any questions, or if you want to dispute this charge, click this link. When you click that link, you're taken to a login page. It looks very real, but it's not. You log in and you've just handed your credentials over to a phisher. Now, the problem, of course, is that those are both sometimes very difficult to notice, to pay attention to. In the login URL or the login attempt, the credential attempt, the thing to pay attention to, of course, is the URL that it takes you to. If it's not the URL that you would expect to be associated with your bank or your shipping company or something else, then it's probably a phishing attack. The pages that they display in the past have often been very easy to identify with lots of misspellings, bad grammar, and so forth. They've gotten a lot better. They really have. And that's something that really boils down to you and I needing to be very aware of phishing and needing to always be skeptical when you are asked or notified about anything in email. Now, the reason this came up for me today is because one of the things that I pay attention to are the number of new vulnerabilities, exploits, breaches, and so forth that we tend to hear about every day. It's interesting in that many of them actually really have no impact on you and me. Or they're completely out of our control because they don't involve us. They're not due to something that we've done. And yet the headlines would make it seem like, oh my gosh, you can't trust anything. Your credentials are already gone. By the time you read this, you're screwed. Not the case. Absolutely not the case. What is usually buried in many of these notifications of here's a new exploit in Windows, or here's something else you can do to gain access that you're not supposed to, again, in Windows or some other operating system, it almost always comes back to there's a step that has to happen first for that exploit to even be reachable by the hackers. And that is phishing. By that I mean many of the breaches that you hear about start with an employee at that company falling for a phishing attempt. Many of the exploits that you hear about, be it in Windows or anywhere else, are all gated because if the malware isn't on the machine that happens to have the vulnerability, then it doesn't matter. How does the malware get on the machine? Through phishing attacks, through somebody falling for a phishing attempt. So don't let the headlines scare you as much as they try to. If you can, take a moment, and if you read through the information about a specific exploit or a newly discovered vulnerability, eventually you'll probably see the word phishing, because that's what it takes for that exploit or that vulnerability to really have any impact. As for you and me, obviously, stay safe, stay skeptical, but understand that at least phishing is gating a lot of what you and I are vulnerable to, and it's in our control to take the time to make sure we're safe. Hope that helps a little bit. For updates, for comments, for related links and more, visit askleo.com/147827. I'm Leo Notenboom, and this is askleo.com. Thanks for watching.